Welcome. Welcome to our online Bible study. This is now our 10th session. So let us move on with today's session. So let us now take, after learning how we can understand the Bible and how we can interpret the Bible, let us now go over to New Testament survey. Okay? So in this particular study, we will first take the rationale behind. The reason why we are taking New Testament survey is for us to have a bird's eye view of each book of the New Testament first. Let's study first the New Testament. Let us talk about the writer, about the style of writing, and there are a lot of things that we will learn when we know who's writing and how he writes. And then probably what are probable sources where he got what he wrote. Okay, we also need to learn about the recipients or the addressee. To whom was it written? Their background, their economic, political, and spiritual background, and why were they the recipients? What's their particular need? The other one is we need to take also into consideration the date and place of writing, the condition during the time of writing, and then the political, again the social, and the spiritual condition during the time of writing. Not only during the time of writing, we also need to consider also contextually the immediate during the event. Okay, so there's first during the event, during the time of writing, and we will move on to that. There are books that have particular purpose or theme, and they are open into it. So we need to know that. In some other, there are problems that is being addressed to. For example, if you study the Pauline epistles, addressing particular subject in every particular congregation or particular location where Apostle Paul wrote his letters. There are some keywords also. And if we have enough time, we will study those keywords and key verses that are there also in our New Testament survey. Okay? So, before taking anything else, let us first take the forms of New Testament literature. There are four forms of New Testament literature. One is the Gospels. We know that the first four books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are called Gospels. Gospels, nothing but euangelion, nothing but good news. And what makes it good news? Okay, when you take the Gospels, a lot of us have the idea that somehow the Gospels are but just the biography about Jesus. No, it's not. It is what it is. Gospel. What part of gospel, how it is presented by some or by two of the writers or by one of the writers, it's all up to them how they presented it. And it's all up to us to realize also and to know why did he include this, why did he not include that particular topic in there. Okay, we will be studying that. And then we'll be studying also the Acts of the Apostles. Another form of literature is the Acts, history, a narrative about what the apostles did. But the title is a little bit misleading because aside from Peter, we didn't know much. Peter and John didn't know much what happened about the other 10 or the 9. And then most of its part also were all about Paul's missionary journeys. And then we have the epistles. We've got the Pauline epistles, 13 of them, and then the general epistles. And last but not least, we have the Apocalypse. So those are the forms of the things of the literature that you and I will be dealing with for some time. We'll be studying, just taking tidbits, just taking bird's eye view from all of these things. I don't want to sound like a teacher in a classroom setting. Much that I would rather have this study that we just go on with it and take what we could get from the background of every book in the New Testament. So let's start with the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first three Gospels were called synoptic. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because basically John has his own agenda, and I will get to that later. But they still talk about who Jesus is, what Jesus did, okay? But for now, let's take first the first three books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was called synoptic because it comes from two Greek words, sun, which is with, and optic, where your optical, ophthalmologist, opta comes from, with eye. So thus, synoptic gospels or synoptic could mean with the same eye. Applying that with the gospels, it is a good news from similar point of view. Using also the gospel, which is euangelion, comes from two Greek words again, the eu, which is good, just like eulogy, euthanasia. Then the angelion, or the from angelos, or if you would like to take that on a masculine messenger. Euangelion means the good news. So when we put two things together, synoptic gospels, similar point of view of the good news, so that could mean the gospels, the good news, from similar viewpoint by three writers. There are two assumptions concerning the synoptic gospels. This is taken from the NIV Study Bible, and some are taken from my notes during my studies. Some will be given. We need to give credit to whom credit is due, as much as I could remember, but there are some that I could not remember where have I taken them, or where did my teachers took them. So be that as it may. The first assumption being is that Matthew and Luke used Mark as major source of their gospels. If that be the case, the assumption being is that Mark was written 50s, in the early 50s, or the late 50s, or the early 60s. Thus making Matthew written in 50s or the late 60s, and Luke a little bit later, probably 5 years or so after Matthew was written. So that is always around 59 to 63 AD. That's the first assumption. The second assumption for the synoptic gospels is that Matthew and Luke did not use Mark as their source. If that be the case, then Matthew must have been written earlier. Mark could be written between 50 to 70 AD, and Matthew could be written in the early 50s. The truth is, the early church believes that the first gospel that was written was Matthew's. That's why Matthew comes first in the New Testament books. Later on, this view was questioned, and later with new evidences, they have come with the following assumptions, and we'll be dealing with some. But with Luke, it seems like he's consistent. Written 15 to 63, even if he did not take it from Mark. Okay? The second one. This I do not know to whom, where did my teachers took it. The two or the fourth document hypothesis. What does it mean? There's Mark, there's Matthew, there's Luke, there's the Lucan source, there's the Matthean source, and there's the Q document, meaning there's a quill, from the German term quill, or just document, the Q document. So they say that's the quill document. Okay. with the assumption that Matthew took from Mark or borrowed from Mark, and Luke also borrowed from Mark. But at the same time, Luke, because he did a thorough study, he must have taken some of it from a document. We call it a quill, or from the Germans, quill document, just document. Matthew took his from a Matthean document. He must have had his own source, or Luke must have had his own source also. We call it Luke and document. And Matthew must have taken some also from the quill document. Having said that, this four-document hypothesis makes it that Mark was first written before Matthew and Luke. And Mark could be the source of Matthew and the source of Luke. And Mark's source is Peter. They said that a lot of what Mark put in his Gospels, or in his Gospel I should say, are from Peter's sermon, that is according to tradition, church tradition. One thing more, I've taken this from Holman's Bible, that out of 661 verses that Mark has, listen to this, out of 661 verses that Mark, the entire 16 chapters, Matthew borrowed 600 verses out of that. That is 90%. 600 verses of 661 are in Matthew. And 380 verses out of 661, that is more than 50%, were borrowed by Luke from Mark. If the hypothesis or the assumption that these two writers borrowed from Mark, and Mark being the first gospel writer. Having said that, let us look now to the particular purpose of writing for the first four writers, the Gospels. We all know that Matthew, when Matthew wrote his Gospel, he focused on Jesus as the Messiah foretold in the Old Testament. That is why we could read a lot of Old Testament passages. Basically, as we could see it, Matthew is writing to an audience that is familiar with the Torah or with the Tanakh. Matthew must have in mind, while writing his Gospels, thinking about his fellow Jews. So his Gospel is filled with those things. Mark, on the other hand, presented Jesus as an active person, presented Jesus' powerful ministry, presented Jesus as the suffering servant. And Mark, when he presented it, you could not read much quotations from the Old Testaments or quotations from the Old Testaments because he's not writing for the Jews. And it seemed to me like he is writing to a different audience. We'll be taking that in a moment. Luke, on the other hand, portrayed Jesus as the Savior for all people. When you read the genealogy of Jesus, while Matthew traces Jesus back to Abraham, Luke traces further than that. We will get there when we get there. Okay. With John, John wrote specifically with one purpose, and that is what he had written in the closing statement of John 20, verse 31. When he said all the things that Jesus did, the whole world could not contain. But these are written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing in Him, we might have life in His name. So, He was specific on that. So, let's move on. There are other reasons also why Gospels were written. One, for their missionary preaching. What is your basis? We've known about the oral and the oral tradition, but this time they have this concrete, never vary. There will be no other versions aside from what is written. What is written becomes permanent. What is written becomes a standard. What is written stays written. Okay? As part of the corporate community life also, so that nobody's presenting it with some deviations. No, but they could just easily read it, just like what you're doing, what we both are doing. Okay? And then to teach others. That's reason for writing the Gospels. How did we know about Jesus? Because we read. How did we come to know Jesus? Because of those who have read before us. Because of them who have read the book before us. Okay? So, let us study now the Gospel of Mark. In a jiffy, we will be dealing with Mark. Mark is also known as John Mark. The early church attests that the book of Mark, or the Gospel of Mark, is his gospel. Papias, in 140 AD, quoting from an earlier source than the Ante-Nicene Fathers, or with the Apostolic Fathers, I should say, in 140 AD, he quoted and he said, Mark is the writer of the Gospel of Mark. And we have also known that Mark, John Mark, is a close associate of Peter, according again to church tradition. That John Mark, because of his association with Peter, wrote all of Peter's sermon. And he was the first one also to write what he has been hearing as oral tradition. He put it into writing and compiled it and put it there. So he was the first one to do that. Some were saying that there must have been an earlier version of the gospel that is extant, that we can no longer find it. But be that as it may, or be that be the case, then we would like to thank Mark for putting it down, for writing whatever he has read, whatever he has heard, whatever tradition that must have been passed on to him. So that's our writer for the Gospel of Mark. Biblical references about this guy can be seen in Acts chapter 12 verse 12, that the mother of John Mark allowed that the believers used her house as meeting place. That's John chapter 12 verse 12. In John chapter 13, 5 and 13, we all know that he accompanied Paul and Barnabas in Paul's second missionary journey. Only that in chapter 15, 36 and 39, somewhere along the way, during the journey, he felt homesick. And so he left. He left Barnabas and Paul during the missionary journey and went home. That caused Paul and Barnabas split, because in the third missionary journey, Paul did not like to bring John Mark along, and Barnabas took John Mark with him. Okay? In Colossians chapter 4 verse 10, seems like Paul now is making amends, or making peace with with Mark, I should say. So he instructed to bring John Mark, And then in 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 1, Paul now wanting to see John Mark. And in Mark chapter 14 verse 51 to 52, this must be part of that. John Mark, in writing his gospel, included this particular young man who ran away naked during the arrest of Jesus. In 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13, we can read now why, according to church tradition, Peter is closely associated with John Mark, because in his closing statements, in sending his greetings, Peter said, when he made the greetings, he said, John Mark also sends his greetings to you. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13. Further moving on, so if we would take that, aside from the early ones that we have taken, that he could have written his gospel around 50s or the early 60s, could probably so. And the place could probably be the regions of Italy. Probably, I keep repeating probably, because no one has made it specifically on this particular place. No one claimed that yet. Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria, these are bishops, said that the place of writing for the Gospel of Mark is Rome. And because he's closely associated with Peter, they were thinking that the Babylon that is being used by Peter in all his writings refer to Rome. So, having said that, let's move over to the recipients. So, if he wrote it in the place of Rome or in the regions of Italy during those years, the recipients could be the church at Rome, particularly the Gentile readers. Why? We will wait for that for the purpose. That is why some of the Jewish customs or traditions, Mark painstakingly explained it in his Gospels. Okay? So, meaning the readers are not familiar with Jewish customs. Furthermore, Mark also translates some of the Aramaic words that are being used. Chapter 3 verse 17, chapter 5 verse 41. And somehow, Mark presented this. He's got this special interest in martyrdom. So, we've got 834 through 38, 39, and 13. So, let's go down to the occasion and purpose. Okay? During the 60s, there was this persecution of the Roman Church. There was this famous fire of Rome. It was in 64 AD. And many historians said that while Rome was burning, Nero was playing his flute. Nero burned Rome. That later on, he blamed the Christians. Because of this, he was able to rally the Romans to go against the Christians. And there followed a widespread persecution for Christians. Because of this persecution, Mark must have in his mind while writing it that he needs to prepare his readers for such sufferings. That's why he presented the life of the Lord being a suffering servant. The life of the Lord being maltreated, persecuted. Then those are the verses. His theme is on discipleship. He's got this most realistic touch in assessing the difficulty of discipleship. He's so honest with it. Discipleship is costly. Persecution comes with the territory of being a disciple. He was so particular on those things. The third one is that sometimes disciples misunderstood their teacher, the rabbi, and he wrote that. And then he made mention also about failures of disciples. So if you want to study about discipleship, take Mark. Mark's gospel will be good at it. There are some distinctive traits that Mark has, okay? His writing is fast-paced. As you could see, he did not mention about the genealogy of Jesus. He did not even mention about the birth of Jesus. Not even the early years of Jesus. But when you read it, he will start the beginning of the gospel of Jesus and immediately dives in the preaching ministry of Jesus. And much of its topics are on the miracles that Jesus did. Okay? He was fast-paced. He uses the term immediately, used 35 times in the book. And he has this appreciation of the humanity of Jesus. You can read that. While doing my pericope, doing my studies in the book of Mark, my paper was even borrowed by my teacher. That's why I started. It's a good place to start with Mark. And I could pretty sure say that I'm in love with Mark and I like his style. Although I love John and how philosophical John sometimes come, but reading Mark will just take you from one place to the other, from one event to the other, fast-paced. Again, the emphasis on the difficulty of discipleship, Mark. So the Gospel of Mark, the emphasis being the cross, discipleship, the teachings of Jesus, the messianic secret. Why did he speak in parables? And then the Son of God. As a starter, let us leave it at that. And I would like, if you've got time, these are just 661 verses. By reading that, it will just take you almost how many hours? Wouldn't even take you that long. So I would encourage you first to please read the book of Mark, and we could probably go through that by Thursday. We will take some verses from Mark and then see the beauty of Mark, how he presented Jesus as the suffering servant, and as he presented also some of the things that are there. I have taken some of those in my live stream, but this will be enough for now. Thank you so much for being in this class. Thank you so much for being in this online Bible study. Again, I'll be seeing you by Thursday, 3:30 through 4, and I'll try to be on that time. Again, thank you so much. If you have some questions, email me. If you've got anything to add for this study, email me. Thank you.